Amina Khan's secret affair with her father-in-law, Farooq, was supposed to stay hidden, but when it led to her husband's brutal death, everything they'd worked to conceal came crashing down. Now, with betrayal, obsession, and murder at the center of it all, Amina's darkest choices are about to be exposed in a way she never imagined. In the peaceful town of Willow Ridge, life moved at a slow and steady pace. Neighbors knew each other by name. Children played in the park until sunset, and Friday evenings were often filled with the sound of prayer and family gatherings. Among the residents, the Khan family blended in seamlessly. Mohammad Khan, a 29-year-old IT specialist, had recently purchased a modest 2-story home on a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of street where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. With him lived his wife, Amina, and his widowed father, Farooq Khan. To the outside world, they were the picture of stability and respectability, a hardworking son, a dutiful wife, and a gentle, aging patriarch. Mohammad and Amina had been married for just over 2 years. Their marriage, like many in their community, had been arranged. Both came from traditional families who believed that love would grow in time. On the surface, it seemed to be working. Amina, 25 and soft-spoken, appeared content in her role as a homemaker. She kept a tidy home, wore modest clothing, and attended the local mosque regularly. Mohammad, though often busy with work, made time for weekly family dinners and was known to be kind, if a bit reserved. Farooq had moved in shortly after Mohammad and Amina's wedding. He had lost his wife several years earlier and had sold his corner grocery store in Karachi before moving permanently to the U.S. to live with his only son. To neighbors, Farooq was friendly, often seen watering the garden or chatting with other retirees during morning walks. He blended well into the suburban rhythm, always present, always watching. Inside the Khan household, things were quiet, almost too quiet. Mohammad's demanding job kept him out late. His hours at the tech firm often stretched into the night, and on weekends, he frequently caught up on emails or attended work calls. Amina, left alone for long stretches of time, grew accustomed to Farooq's presence. He became her daily companion, the one constant figure in her life. They would often eat lunch together, share tea in the afternoon, and discuss everything from family traditions to personal dreams. But behind the polite smiles and tidy lawn, something more complicated had begun to stir. No one suspected that anything was wrong. To friends and family, the Khans were just another immigrant family making their way in a new country, holding fast to their values. But beneath the calm exterior, emotions were simmering: loneliness, desire, and a growing sense of restlessness. In Willow Ridge, where scandal was rare and life was uneventful, no one could have imagined the darkness slowly creeping inside the Khan household. Though their home appeared picture-perfect from the outside, the cracks in Mohammad and Amina's marriage were quietly beginning to show. Their union, formed not by love, but by tradition, lacked the emotional depth and intimacy that Amina had quietly yearned for. Mohammad was not unkind. He was respectful, responsible, and provided for her, but his focus was almost entirely on his career. His job in IT demanded long hours and late nights, leaving little time for connection or conversation. When he was home, he was often distracted, buried in his laptop or scrolling through his phone. Their conversations, once filled with curiosity and effort, had become transactional, reduced to meal plans and reminders. Amina, still adjusting to life in a foreign country, felt isolated. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the house, her only regular human interaction being with Farooq. She missed her family back home, missed the laughter of siblings, the warmth of her mother's kitchen, the familiarity of her own culture. Here, in suburban Willow Ridge, everything felt distant, except for Farooq, who had become an unexpected source of comfort. Farooq was nothing like his son. Where Mohammad was quiet and withdrawn, Farooq was talkative and attentive. He noticed when Amina looked tired, complimented her cooking, and shared stories from his youth in Pakistan. At first, Amina welcomed the company as a distraction. Farooq had a way of making her feel seen. He asked her opinion, listened intently, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts. She had never expected to develop such a bond with her father-in-law, But day by day, a connection formed that began to feel deeper than it should. The household dynamic slowly began to shift. Amina found herself dressing up just a little more in the afternoons, choosing her favorite scarf or adding a touch of lipstick before tea. She told herself it was to feel better, to lift her own spirits, but deep down she knew who she wanted to notice. Farooq, too, seemed increasingly drawn to her. He lingered in the kitchen longer, found excuses to be in the same room, and praised her in ways that felt more personal than paternal. What had started as innocent companionship was evolving into something unspoken and dangerous. Neither had crossed a line yet, but both were inching closer to it with every shared moment. And while Amina still wore the outward role of a dutiful wife, her thoughts had begun to wander. The boundaries were blurring. The home, once filled with silence, was now thick with tension and possibility. Something was beginning, but neither of them fully understood how far it would go or how much it would cost. As the weeks passed, the bond between Amina and Farooq deepened in a way neither of them could have predicted. What had begun as a simple connection, rooted in the quiet comfort of shared moments, had shifted into something more charged. The once innocent chats over tea became something else entirely. They would talk late into the night, long after Mohammad had gone to bed, their conversations drifting from the mundane to the personal. Farooq began sharing more about his past, his youth in Pakistan, his business, the dreams he had once had, and Amina found herself drawn to his stories. They were different from the life Mohammad spoke of, different from the life she had imagined for herself. Farooq's attention was intoxicating. Amina began to notice how his gaze lingered on her longer than it should. When he complimented her, it felt genuine, almost too genuine. It wasn't just about her cooking anymore. It was about how she carried herself, how she looked in the soft light of the evening. His praise made her feel noticed, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Mohammad, despite his good intentions, was often absent, both physically and emotionally. Amina couldn't recall the last time he had truly looked at her or given her his full attention. Farooq, on the other hand, seemed to see her in a way that no one else did. At first, Amina tried to push the thoughts aside. She knew it was wrong. He was her father-in-law after all. But the more time they spent together, the more difficult it became to ignore the attraction. Farooq seemed to sense her hesitation, but he didn't back off. Instead, he became more persistent, a subtle pressure that grew over time. He would touch her arm as he passed by, brush his hand against her shoulder, small gestures that sent shivers down her spine. She didn't pull away. She didn't know how to. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, it happened. They were sitting in the living room, the soft hum of the television in the background, when Farooq leaned in closer. His hand found hers, warm and firm. Amina froze. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, the world outside that room ceased to exist. Her heart raced, her thoughts spinning. But when he slowly moved to kiss her, she didn't stop him. It wasn't love. It wasn't even lust. It was something darker, something that had been building in both of them for weeks. That kiss, brief and trembling, marked the point of no return. Amina felt a mixture of shame and exhilaration as the gravity of what they had just done settled in. But despite the guilt that immediately followed, there was a part of her that felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. What started as an innocent connection had now become a dangerous game, a secret that neither could take back. The affair had begun. But it wasn't just about desire anymore. It was about power, control, and a twisted need for something neither of them could fully understand. And as Amina looked into Farooq's eyes, she knew that their lives would never be the same. As the affair between Amina and Farooq continued, it became clear that their relationship was no longer confined to secret, stolen moments. What had once been a whispered attraction had turned into an all-consuming obsession. Amina, though torn by guilt and confusion, found herself caught in a whirlwind she couldn't escape. Farooq, too, had become increasingly possessive. What had begun as mutual desire had quickly morphed into something darker, something that left no room for hesitation or retreat. Farooq's behavior toward Amina grew more intense. He became fixated on her, his every action geared toward keeping her close. The once gentle conversations now felt loaded, heavy with unspoken meaning. He began to question her more frequently, asking where she'd been, who she'd spoken to, and what she'd been thinking. It wasn't the curiosity of a father-in-law concerned about his daughter-in-law's well-being. It was the behavior of a man desperate to control. He subtly isolated her, pushing her further from Mohammad and the outside world. Amina, already struggling with her feelings of isolation, found herself becoming more dependent on Farooq. She no longer saw it as manipulation. She told herself that it was simply the closeness they had built over time. But it wasn't just that. Farooq's words, laced with promises of a future together, had begun to plant seeds in her mind. He spoke of how they could leave Mohammad, start anew, and build a life without the constraints of their current reality. He painted pictures of freedom, freedom that seemed impossible in the rigid structure of her arranged marriage. But each time Amina hesitated, Farooq's frustration grew. He began to threaten, albeit subtly. He would say things like, "If you want to be free, you know what needs to be done." His tone, at times soothing and at other times sharp, made it clear that there was no other choice. Amina was caught in his grasp, both emotionally and psychologically. The man who had once been a father figure had now become her only source of validation, the one who made her feel seen and desired. Despite the heavy burden of guilt she carried, Amina started to consider Farooq's words more seriously. The idea of running away with him, of leaving Mohammad, began to take root. The tension between them grew, fueled by both passion and the constant fear of discovery. Every moment they spent together, every touch, every lingering glance felt like both a gift and a curse. But Farooq's obsession didn't end there. He began to manipulate Amina further, making her feel as though she had no way out except through him. The situation became more dangerous with every passing day. Amina knew they were walking a fine line, but the hold Farooq had on her was undeniable. In those quiet moments when Mohammad wasn't around, Amina found herself questioning everything: her marriage, her loyalty, even her identity. The affair had started as an escape, but now it was the only thing she felt tethered to. As her connection with Farooq deepened, it became clear that the stakes were higher than ever. The point of no return was in sight, and both Amina and Farooq seemed to be heading toward a dark and inevitable conclusion. Tension in the Khan household was mounting. Mohammad, although often absorbed in his work, began to notice the subtle changes in Amina. She had grown more distant, more distracted. Her once warm demeanor had become cold and reserved, and she no longer looked at him the same way. He couldn't place it at first, but something felt off. His attempts to talk to her to reconnect were met with polite but empty responses. Amina, too, seemed to be retreating further into herself, spending more time alone and less time with him. The few quiet moments they shared together felt forced, as if the space between them had widened, even though they sat side by side. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Mohammad decided to confront Amina. He had asked her repeatedly if something was wrong, but she had always brushed it off with excuses or vague reassurances. This time, however, he was determined to get answers. He had noticed the tension in the house, the way Amina avoided his touch, the way her eyes darted around whenever he tried to engage her in conversation. It was clear something was wrong, and he wasn't going to let it fester any longer. As the two of them sat across from each other in their living room, the air thick with unspoken words, Mohammed's frustration finally bubbled over. He asked her directly what had been going on. Why had she been so distant? Why was she so preoccupied with things he couldn't understand? His voice, though calm, carried an edge of hurt and confusion. Amina, caught off guard by the sudden confrontation, had no response at first. She couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. The guilt of her affair with Farooq weighed heavily on her chest, suffocating her from the inside. She had been hiding it for months, and the thought of telling Mohammad felt like an impossible task. She couldn't destroy him, not when she knew how deeply he cared for her despite everything. She could never admit to the betrayal that had taken root in their home, the betrayal that had eaten away at their relationship in the dark corners of their lives. Instead, she chose to lie. She told Mohammad that everything was fine, that she had simply been stressed and overwhelmed by the pressures of managing the house and taking care of Farooq. She assured him that it wasn't about him, that she was just feeling disconnected and needed time to figure things out. Mohammad, though skeptical, accepted her explanation. His frustration momentarily eased. But something in his gut told him that there was more to the story than she was letting on. In the days that followed, Mohammad kept his distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that Amina was hiding something from him, and the thought gnawed at him. But the lies continued, and so did the growing distance between them. Amina, meanwhile, felt suffocated by her deception. Every smile she forced, every false reassurance she gave, made the walls of her own guilt close in around her. She had no idea how much longer she could keep up the facade. The affair had consumed her, and yet, she felt trapped in it, unable to break free without destroying everything. It was a dark spiral, and she was falling deeper with each passing day. On a quiet Thursday morning, the calm of the Khan household was shattered. It was a day like any other. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, birds chirped outside, and Mohammad had left for work early, as usual. Amina was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for Farooq, when the shrill sound of a phone ringing echoed through the house. It was a neighbor, calling to inform her that the police had arrived at the house and that there had been an incident. Confused and alarmed, Amina rushed to the front of the house, her heart pounding in her chest. What had happened? Was it a mistake? She saw 2 police cars parked outside, their lights flashing, casting an eerie red glow on the quiet street. As she approached the door, an officer stopped her, gently ushering her away from the scene. The shock on his face told her everything she needed to know. There had been a death. It wasn't long before the full truth began to emerge. Inside the house, investigators discovered Mohammad's body. His lifeless form was sprawled across the bedroom floor, an unnatural stillness surrounding him. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident. Perhaps he had tripped and fallen, hitting his head on the dresser. But the detectives were immediately suspicious. The scene didn't fit the description of a simple fall. There were no signs of struggle, no indications of a break-in or robbery. But there was something odd about the positioning of his body, the bruises on his neck, clear signs of strangulation. As Amina stood outside, her mind raced. She couldn't understand what had happened. Mohammad had been fine when he left for work that morning. How could he be dead? But deep inside, something gnawed at her, a feeling of dread that she couldn't shake. The authorities were asking questions. Where had she been? What had she been doing? Had she seen anything unusual? It didn't take long for them to start piecing together the family's dynamics, and soon, the focus turned to the only other people in the house, Amina and Farooq. Farooq, though initially calm and cooperative, became increasingly agitated as the questioning continued. His story was shaky. He claimed that he had been in the living room all morning, unaware of what had happened in the bedroom. He denied any involvement in Mohammad's death, but his nervousness was palpable. His eyes darted around, and his answers lacked the certainty one would expect in the face of tragedy. Amina, still in shock, couldn't bring herself to speak. She could barely process the events unfolding before her, let alone answer the barrage of questions from detectives. As the day wore on, the authorities began to dig deeper into the family's history. They reviewed phone records, text messages, and security footage. They discovered troubling details, calls between Amina and Farooq at odd hours, texts that hinted at something more than just a familial relationship. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This was something far darker, and the investigation was taking a chilling turn. Amina, now realizing the gravity of the situation, felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her. Her heart raced as she faced the police, the truth threatening to break free from her lips. The lies she had told Mohammad, the affair with Farooq, everything she had worked so hard to hide was coming undone. And as the detectives closed in, one question echoed in her mind. Had the affair led to this? Was it the love they shared, or was it something far more sinister? The days following Mohammad's death were a blur for Amina. The shock of losing her husband, someone she had married out of duty, yet still deeply cared for, was nearly unbearable. But beneath the grief, there was an overwhelming sense of fear. As the police investigation moved closer to uncovering the truth, she could no longer deny that something terrible had happened. What was once a secret affair had now escalated into something far more sinister, and she was at the center of it. In the days after the tragedy, the police began to probe deeper into the events surrounding Mohammed's death. Amina's every move was scrutinized. The investigators questioned her repeatedly, and though her outward appearance seemed composed, inside, her mind raced. She had lived through months of guilt, hiding her affair with Farooq, keeping the darkest part of her life a secret. Now everything was unraveling. The police were relentless. They had her phone records, the suspicious texts between her and Farooq, the calls at odd hours. Nothing seemed innocent anymore. It wasn't long before the detectives turned their focus on Farooq. His shaky demeanor had already drawn suspicion, and as the investigation deepened, the evidence piled up. His story of having been in the living room all morning, unaware of what had happened in the bedroom, started to fall apart. The officers were starting to connect the dots. They had found traces of his DNA in places where it shouldn't have been, and his fingerprints were on the very objects that had been disturbed in Mohammed's room. His alibi was weak, and his nervousness was growing harder to conceal. Farooq had always been a man of charm, of calculated calm, but now, under the weight of the investigation, cracks were appearing in his facade. Amina knew him better than anyone. She saw the way he shifted uncomfortably in his chair when questioned, how his gaze darted away when the investigators asked pointed questions. But what terrified her most was the fact that she was just as implicated in this dark web. She had been complicit in their secret. The love she had felt for Farooq had led her to this point, and now, it seemed like there was no way out. Her mind flashed back to the days leading up to Mohammed's death. The kisses, the touches, the promises Farooq had whispered to her. How he had convinced her that they were meant to be together, that they could leave everything behind. But now it felt like all those moments had been part of a dangerous game, one that had gone too far. She had fallen into a trap, not just of love but of manipulation, and now it seemed like there would be no escaping the consequences. The guilt that had weighed on Amina since the affair began now became a crushing burden. She remembered the night she and Farooq had shared that first kiss, the moment that had set everything in motion. In that instant, she hadn't known where it would lead. But now, as the walls closed in around her, she realized just how far they had fallen. Farooq had promised her freedom, but instead, they had become prisoners to their own actions. Amina's world was spiraling out of control. The person she had once trusted most, her own father-in-law, had turned out to be her captor, and now she had to decide what role she would play in this nightmare. Would she turn on Farooq to save herself? Would she continue to protect him, knowing the truth would ruin them both? With each passing moment, the pressure mounted, and Amina found herself at a crossroads, torn between loyalty, fear, and the undeniable consequences of what had happened. As the investigation continued, Amina found herself trapped in a spiraling nightmare. Every moment felt suffocating, the pressure of what she had done threatening to consume her. The police had pieced together enough of the evidence to know that there was more to Mohammed's death than an accident. They had no solid proof yet, but the circumstantial evidence was damning, and they were growing closer to uncovering the full truth. Amina's emotions were a mixture of guilt, fear, and confusion. She couldn't bring herself to blame Farooq completely. After all, she had chosen to be with him. But the reality of what they had done was settling in with full force. She had betrayed her husband, her family, and herself. What had started as a desperate attempt to find love and connection had turned into a horrifying series of events that neither she nor Farooq could control. Farooq, meanwhile, was becoming more erratic with each passing day. The calm, controlled figure she had once known seemed to be unraveling. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by a constant tension. He had always been manipulative, but now, as the investigation closed in on him, his desperation was palpable. He had started to avoid Amina, not out of guilt or remorse, but because he was beginning to panic. He knew that the police would be focusing on him more closely soon. He could feel the noose tightening, and it terrified him. Amina tried to reach out to him, to make sense of what had happened between them. But Farooq wasn't the same man she had once shared stolen glances and whispered promises with. He was cold, distant, and volatile. There were moments when he would lash out at her, blaming her for the situation they were in. But there were also times when he would try to comfort her, telling her that everything would be okay. That they would be free of Mohammed's shadow, that they would finally be together without fear. But Amina could no longer believe him. She had seen the cracks in his facade, and she knew deep down that their relationship had never been based on love, but on manipulation and deceit. One evening, as the investigation reached a boiling point, Amina finally made the decision to speak to the police. The weight of her silence had become unbearable, and she knew that the truth needed to come out, even if it meant exposing her darkest secret. As she sat in the sterile interrogation room, surrounded by detectives who had grown increasingly suspicious of her, Amina felt a strange sense of clarity. She knew that the consequences of her actions would change everything, but she also understood that this was the only way to break free from the grip of her own guilt. The decision was not an easy one. She had spent months denying the truth, hiding behind the lies, trying to protect herself and Farooq. But in the end, she realized that she could no longer live in the shadows of what had happened. The affair had destroyed everything she had once held dear. The man she had loved, her husband Mohammad, was gone, and the man who had once been her protector, her father-in-law, had become the architect of her destruction. With trembling hands, Amina confessed. She told the detectives everything: the affair, the lies, the manipulation. She revealed how Farooq had slowly wormed his way into her life, how she had been too blinded by desire and loneliness to see the truth. She didn't know what would happen next. The thought of facing the consequences terrified her, but she knew there was no turning back. The truth was out, and the path to redemption, if there was one, would be paved with the darkest of choices. Amina's confession rocked the investigation to its core. The truth, raw and painful, had finally been laid bare. The weight of her words lingered in the cold, sterile interrogation room as the detectives absorbed every detail of the sordid affair. They had suspected for weeks, but now they had their answers. Amina's role in Mohammed's death was not just incidental, it was pivotal. Yet as much as she had confessed, the case was far from resolved. The detectives knew that Amina was only one part of the puzzle. Farooq, the man who had driven the affair, remained a key player in this deadly game. The authorities wasted no time in shifting their focus back to him. Amina's testimony had confirmed what they had already suspected. Farooq had orchestrated the entire situation, manipulating Amina with promises of a future they could never have. But it wasn't just love that had driven him. It was a much darker desire to control. The more the detectives learned about Farooq, the more they realized how deeply ingrained his manipulative tendencies were. Farooq had always been the patriarch, the strong figure in the family, but beneath the surface, his control over Amina and his son was unsettling. He had never been the loving father-in-law that he appeared to be. He had been a predator, looking for a vulnerable target to feed his ego and satisfy his own twisted desires. Amina had been his prey, someone he could manipulate and possess without anyone suspecting his true intentions. He had carefully constructed an image of a respectable man, a man of faith, a man of tradition. But the truth was far darker. In the weeks that followed, Farooq was arrested, his fate sealed by the unraveling of his lies. He tried to deny everything, claiming that Amina had exaggerated their relationship, that he was being framed. But the evidence against him was undeniable. There was too much to discredit, too many inconsistencies in his story. His fingerprints, on the objects in Mohammed's room, the text between him and Amina, and the forensic evidence, everything pointed back to him. Amina, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of her actions. She had been complicit in the affair, but the weight of the murder was something she could not ignore. She had been manipulated, yes, but she had also made choices that led to the destruction of the life she had built. The grief of losing Mohammed, the shame of betraying him, was something she would carry with her forever. Her trial was both a public spectacle and a private torment. The media swarmed around her, painting her as the villain in a story of betrayal and scandal. The town of Willow Ridge, once quiet and peaceful, was now divided. Some sympathized with Amina, seeing her as a victim of Farooq's manipulation, while others condemned her for the affair and the death of her husband. The whispers, the judgment, and the scrutiny were unbearable. Amina's once sheltered life had crumbled into something unrecognizable. Farooq's trial, though, was where the true horror of this story came to light. As the details of his manipulation were revealed, it became clear that he had preyed on more than just Amina. His control extended beyond the affair. He had used his position of authority to dominate every aspect of the family's life. He had seen himself as untouchable, as someone above reproach, but in the end, his greed, his need for power, had led to his downfall. Amina's testimony, though painful, played a critical role in exposing Farooq for the monster he truly was. But it was too late for redemption. The damage had been done, and while the law would serve its justice, Amina would be left to pick up the pieces of her broken life. The love she had sought had led her into a nightmare, and now she was left with the scars of a family torn apart by betrayal and violence.